For our COBT listeners and viewers, it's Maynard, Mike, and Bill Flores here with a really special guest and a good friend. We're going to get to talk to Senator Alan Armstrong. We got to know Alan as the CEO of Williams, but we also got to know him through the years as someone who cared a lot about energy policy, the country, infrastructure, everything we need to do to make the country work better. It's exciting that he is now a senator from Oklahoma, and he's up in Washington trying to get some of these things done. Alan, thank you so much for joining us. We can't wait to talk with you about your impressions, what you've learned, the American Energy and Mineral Infrastructure Act, just the whole thing. So thanks so much for making time.
Glad to be here. Thank you all for having me today. It's always nice seeing you, Maynard.
Awesome. Well, Mike, before we jump in with Alan, anything you tell us about the markets or the news or?
Yeah, just a couple points. We'll make it quick. You know, we talked about it on Tuesday's COBT that the CPI print came in well below expectations. Today we had PPI came in well below expectations. So the 10-year bond yield's down to around 4.55%. And so it's taken a little bit of the pressure off the Fed to raise interest rates. So that news today basically sent the stock market up. We've had the stock market pull back a little bit today, but we're up probably 0.25% or thereabouts. As far as oil, WTI and Brent are pretty much flat at around $80, $85 respectively. Obviously, Trump, there's a lot of commotion going on in the Middle East, but it's surprising that oil prices aren't up more, but that's where we are. As far as the S&P 500 today, the biggest gainers today are telecom. And the reason telecom is doing well today is because Google is being purchased by Buffett. That came out today. So obviously, there's some follow through with investors. One last thing before we hand it off to Alan here. I just wanted to kind of, give a little history of Williams. When Alan became CEO, this was early in, January 2011. The market cap of Williams was $14.5 billion. The enterprise value is around $24-25 billion. EBITDA was about $3 billion, so 8 times EBITDA. Today, Williams is a $90 billion market cap company, $125 billion enterprise value company, $8.5 billion in EBITDA expected for next year, so 14.5 times EBITDA. So over those 14 to 15 years, you've seen market cap go up by 6 times, EV go up by 5 times, EBITDA go up by 3 times, and the valuation multiple increased 6.5 multiple points. That is value creation I've ever seen it. So back to you, Maynard.
Well, that was like, we're going to talk to the coach. He's had a number of good seasons before he went to Washington. Alan, it is great to have you. I was thinking over the years, the CIRA conference always had big moments. And one of the big moments was you were at CIRA one year and you told people how much it cost to build a pipeline, and you exposed that so much of the cost had nothing to do with the pipeline itself. And it was it was kind of one of those moments where I think everybody at the whole conference said, we got to fix that. The problem is it's been around for a while. So,
hey, Maynard, I can give you the quote if you'd like.
Okay, Mike's got the quote.
Said at the CIRA conference, one of our current projects, the permitting costs alone are twice as much as what we're spending on the pipe itself.
There you go. But you're there now, and you're on the ground zero of where all this is happening. What would you tell us about what it is like to go from outside in and now try to get it done there in DC?
Yeah, thank you all for having me again. First of all, I would say overall it's been a pretty positive experience. It's a real challenge to go from something that you've done for a long time and you kind of, the plays get a little slower and, same problem comes in every day, but it's got different shoes on. But here, totally different set of skills required to get things done. And so I find that kind of new challenge as really kind of invigorating, frankly. So I've enjoyed that part of it. On the one hand, on the other hand, it is kind of reaffirmed my perspective that while there's a lot of great dedicated talent here within the Senate, the direct expertise a lot of times that we would hope, kind of firsthand experience with some of the challenges is not known all that well. And so So the good news is, I think because of that, I think I have a lot to offer. The bad news is, I would say it's not always just best ideas that win around here. So a lot of focus on seniority and committee structure and jurisdiction within the committees that tends to stand in the way, I think, of getting the very best ideas brought forth into law. So, but I've been, really focused. Love the staff I get to work with. And there's a lot of really well-intended senators on both sides of the aisle, and I'm trying to marshal those, folks into support for a bill that would really move the needle for our country on permitting. And I find it interesting. A lot of times people will say, "Well, duh, you're the pipeline guy. Of course, you're going to come in here and want to try to get permitting done for the sake of your own business." And I always kind of remind people, and your audience knows this as well as anybody, it's not a bad thing to be an incumbent pipeline company when it's really, really impossible to build new pipelines. And it, tends to drive up the value of a scarce commodity in terms of pipeline capacity. But long term, I think that's a terrible thing for our country, and it's ultimately bad for the industry to the point that we drive the cost of our product, beyond, and the services that we provide beyond what people are willing to pay for them long term. And so, but this, really is an effort to take on what I think can really stop our country long term. It's kind of like the public debt. Everybody knows it's bad. Everybody knows it's got to get solved, but it's always kind of gets just pushed down the road one more day. And permitting is kind of that same issue where it can really strangle our country and the competitive advantages that we've had for so long, if we don't fix it. But it's not a particularly popular issue because the everyday person doesn't understand how that drives their utility prices higher, how it lessens the competitiveness of our nation. And so it really does take some long-term thinking, and frankly, somebody like myself that has no political ambition, to come in and try to tackle something that's really important for our country, but is not a super popular issue, frankly. So I'm glad I'm here and having the chance to try to tackle this and pushing hard on it every day.
I was thinking,
Mayor,
Alan,
Yeah,
go
Mayor,
ahead, Bill. I saw you.
know,
I saw you smiling a little bit, so you know what it's like to go up there.
Well, if you don't mind, I was going to start off by asking a personal question for Senator Armstrong. Served as a C-level guy in the upstream industry for several years before deciding to run for Congress. What caused you to do that?
I was in the process. Chad Zamrin, who's the new CEO, had taken the CEO role back in July, and I was super excited about that. He's doing a fantastic job. And July of 25, and I was exec chair, and really this came along, and it was one of those things where the governor asked you to do it, and I thought, wow, I can sit around and gripe about this the rest of my life and blame everybody else for not getting anything done, or I can take my turn in the ring and give it my best. And so it wasn't any more complicated than that, frankly.
Well, that's great to hear. For me, it was cap and trade passed the House. And I said, somebody's got to go stop that. And ultimately decided to do that myself. Maynard, sorry to interrupt the flow here, but I thought I'd start off with
No,
that.
well, the mirroring of you two guys, energy exec goes to DC. That was a good catch there, Bill. I was going to ask you, Alan, we had a China expert on the podcast. It goes back maybe a couple months ago. And it really detailed how ambitious China is, how pronounced the competition is with the United States. Things like they're developing small tactical nuclear weapons. I mean, just really laid out the rivalry. And then the comment was, quote, everybody in Washington understands this, that this is a bipartisan thing. Everybody gets it. And our comment was, well, that may be, but we don't have permitting reform. Yeah. So how can you be serious about, like, we're in a national competition, we got to win AI, we have security threats, we care about Taiwan, all these things, and you can't build stuff. So I'm curious how the permitting discussion fits into the national security discussion, just what your take is on all that.
Well, we're certainly trying to drive that home, but again, I think, more than I'd like to admit, or more than I probably wanted to know, the issues that's good for our long term for our nation are not necessarily top of mind when it comes to what people are going to focus on, and particularly right here ahead of the midterm. So I would just say I've been surprised by how the more topical, popular issues tend to kind of grab people's motivation and what they're willing to spend time, and what can make it to the floor and what can't. And so that's the answer to your question. Again, it's just like public debt. Everybody knows it's an issue and needs to be dealt with, but it's not necessarily going to get action on it until there's a crisis. And I always tell people that, our infrastructure is like bridges. Nobody really cares about a bridge until it falls down. And the weakness that we're building for ourselves by not having adequate infrastructure is starting to show itself into political topics like people's utility bills. And so I would say, unfortunately, even though I would say that our national security is an even more important thing than people's utility bills, the utility bill aspect of it is the thing that'll catch politicians' attention more if you can connect it. If you can force and you can really educate people to say, you want to know why your utility bill is so high? It's because your governor, decided, or your governor in the state next door decided to not allow infrastructure to be built across the state. That's why your utility bills are high. And trying to connect the Sierra Clubs of the world to why your utility bill is so high. And so I think having to, whether I completely agree with you that it's longer term, it's more important from a national security perspective, but in the short term, you have to connect it to something that is going to actually politically motivate people around here, unfortunately.
And do you find, Alan, as you, it seems like one of the issues in permitting over the last handful of years has been sort of a left-right energy transition. There's been this Hatfields and McCoys around types of energy, and both sides could never come together and say, build it all. How do you see those dynamics now? Have people, for instance, stop debating natural gas, and we can all agree, like, hey, that's an awesome fuel, we should be using it? Like, how much of that old transition debate shows up in this permitting discussion?
Yeah, I think that has absolutely become much less of an issue. And the basic principles of saying, in fact, the bill that we put out, one of the primary principles behind it is that it's going to be energy source neutral. And so we're not here to pick winners and losers, and we're not here to say, that we're not going to allow wind to be built either, or solar. So it is truly an attempt to be completely energy source neutral, but focused on how do we actually get the infrastructure built in a way that continues to protect the environment, but allows some certainty and some time frame that people can count on and invest in. And so that's really what we're trying to accomplish on that front. And I think the concept of the blue versus red issue on this is lessened, except for we're going into midterm and there is a real focus, and I'm seeing it as I'm gaining bipartisan support for this bill, that the leadership of the Dems is saying, no way are we going to let anything positive get done in this environment for the Republicans. Now, I find that really strange because from my perspective, it's positive for both sides of the House. It's positive for our country, and I don't think it gets the Republicans a big win, and I don't think it gets the Democrats a big win in the midterms either way. Hopefully, it's just people saying, thank God we have a Congress that's focused on our country instead of who's going to, which party's going to win. But I would say in terms of the actual individual senators that are key to making this happen, everybody on both sides of the aisle understands how important, and there's very little debate around don't do what's good for pipelines, or let's don't do what's good for transmission. The folk, I think we're past that. So I'm encouraged by that. That's come a long ways from where it was a couple of years ago. And I, one of my pitches to industry has been, listen, we as industry would sit and gripe at the political leaders and say, why can't you guys get together on this? And my position to industry has been, why don't you guys speak with one voice about not trying to get subsidy for this, or trying to pick a fuel or an energy source? Why don't you be the one saying, hey, we want it good for any and all infrastructure? And when you can do that, then you'll actually have you'll actually be a positive motive towards getting permitting done, because the issue is 60 votes, period. The House has done great work on bringing bills forward. The bill that we laid out 3 weeks ago now, that bill actually is kind of a culmination of a lot of the great work in the House, and therefore kind of reduces the amount of resistance to go back through the House in its final form. But we were very careful to try to adopt as much of the good work out of the House as we possibly could pull together.
Do you mind, from your background in industry, just as you've thought about this bill and what we really need, maybe talk about some of the key ingredients as you saw them, like because you can't have everything, but what are the real core building blocks we need in a permitting reform?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, I think in terms of getting something that can pass, and get support from both sides, it does need to be energy source neutral. No subsidies towards a fuel, explicit or implied. It needs to incorporate. This is probably, from a pipeline perspective, this has always been the tool that's been used by environmental opposition, is the state water quality rights under the 401 water quality certificate, which is under the Clean Water Act. That has been a loose cannon in the permitting process for a long time, because there's no real standards around which a state is obligated to hold anybody to, so they can basically make up their standards as to whatever they want them to be. And under the NEPA reform, the judicial standard is arbitrary and capricious. So if you get denied a certificate, you have to go prove that the state wasn't being arbitrary and capricious. So they can always come up with, any general counsel of a DEQ can always come up with something that won't be considered arbitrary and capricious, despite being able to kill a project. And so that's a really key element of this, is the 401 water quality certificate. We've been working with the renewables industry and the transmission industry to say, listen, if you get FERC siting authority, which is another one of the key elements here, if you do get FERC siting authority for transmission, you're going to have a red state tool on your hands on the 401 water quality certificate, because there's really no definition or standard. It's completely subjective, and therefore it makes itself as the perfect political tool.
And Alan, just so maybe, I think everybody follows this, but just to make sure we do. So you have a federal approved project. It's going to come, let's say, through your state, but it's an interstate situation, transmission line, pipeline, whatever it is. Some state can say, even under the current rules, even though it's federally approved and passed all the muster, they can say, in our view, under the Water Act, we're going to deny it. And I think of this as New York State and pipelines, but I know there's other examples. So, and then that standard is, as you say, subjective. And so it's really hard to fight. So not only is it a state held weapon, it's a hard to fight weapon. Is that
fair? And it really doesn't, you think about, as an investor, you think about trying to invest in a project when you have this completely arbitrary issue hanging around out here that you really can't control, it really makes project. And unfortunately, the way it's been set in the past, it comes after you've spent 4 years doing an EIS. So if you think about, and in fact, our solution on this is to make sure that it's concurrent with the FERC process. So today you go do an EIS and you spend 4 years with all the other agencies, state and federal, figuring out the best path and the best route for linear infrastructure. And then after that's settled and after you have your certificate conditioned on the 401, the state comes back a year after that and says, you know, I don't think I really like that route. You need to change this. Well, if you accept that, you're back to square one in the EIS process all over again.
And this is where you get the 2-to-1
do loop, and it kills. You know, it makes what used to be a 10 to 12% return industry into a 30% return industry because the risk is that high of all the development costs on the front end of a project. And so what does that mean? It means that people's bills are going to be 3 times higher. And so that's really the thing we've been trying to really advise people is like, you're not killing the big bad pipeline company. You're hurting the utility customer because they're the ones going to pay the bill on this. And so that's really, though, the reason the 401 is such a deadly and effective tool is it really has no standards around it.
Does this line of that thought that you just had as you talk to people and try to gather support, does this resonate? And by that I mean, if you're pro-consumer and if you kind of sort of don't like big companies making a bunch of money, the thing you would do is make it really easy for people to add more supply, to get more competition. The big companies don't make as much, and the little guy pays less. So does this resonate with people?
The people that it doesn't resonate with are the people that get a lot of their funding from the Sierra Clubs of the world, because they know this is the tool that they've weaponized. And so to them, it's easy to just continue to villainize the big bad energy company, and the average consumer isn't smart enough to know that that really isn't the problem, that really is falling back on them. So I would say people that understand business and care about business, care about consumers, and there's a lot of Dems that do, thankfully, are getting it. But the people that have kind of made their mark of being the anti-climate change guy and the people that are really align themselves with the NGOs on that front, they need a villain, and they've done a really good job of making the energy company and the pipeline company the villain. So your understanding of the market is like, I don't have to make that pitch to you, but doing that in a political form is a little more difficult.
So there's the water piece. You were taking through some of these key components.
Yeah. So the water piece, making sure that any and all agencies, there are other agencies that tend to try to operate outside the one lead agency. But one of the key principles and part of this bill is to make sure that there is one lead agency. In the case of pipelines, it's FERC. In case of transmission, it would be FERC. But there's other things like wind and other issues that need one lead federal agency to make sure that the entire process is governed and you don't have these concurrent do loops like I talked about earlier. One other thing is we are, as a core principle is no degradation of environmental protections that exist today. So we're not trying to, do anything that would actually impact the environment negatively. And then finally, and probably a really important, final issue here is making sure that if you are issued a permit in a lawful manner, that a court or a executive branch can't vacate those certificates. And that's happened in a number of circumstances where people have, in fact, Williams had the Regional Energy Access Project, and the project was up and running for 9 months. It was $1 billion project. The dead of winter, pipeline was nearly fully loaded with use, and the DC Court of Appeals came out and vacated FERC's certificate, saying that that they hadn't done an adequate study of greenhouse gas emissions impact on the project. So nothing Williams had done wrong, honestly, because we complied with everything FERC told us to do. And actually, there was no law requiring a greenhouse gas emissions rule, but that's what the DC Circuit came up with. And that's happened in a number of cases where courts have actually vacated a certificate that was issued to do construction after you went through all this morass. So if you think about, the risk, I remember walking into the boardroom after we got that order and the board looking at me like, why in the hell would we ever try to invest in a pipeline project again with this kind of risk? And so that's the kind of icing you get. And, if you're Equinor and you got some of your permits pulled on the offshore wind projects, you probably feel the same way. Mm-hmm. And so, we've kind of gone back and forth with the administration on that topic, but I don't think it's a good idea for the executive branch, as long as somebody's meeting the conditions of the permit. I don't think it's a good idea for the executive branch or the judicial branch to be able to jerk a certificate that's been issued.
Do you think, Alan, it's funny, we had a fusion show earlier this week, and you think of fusion as, that's obviously, highly scientific and futuristic. But one of the things that the fusion CEO said is the NRC has put in place a regulatory framework around fusion, and it is therefore now drawing capital. And so this comment you made about, clarity so that investors feel comfortable, boards and investors, you're not going to put money in stuff that doesn't have regulatory clarity. Is this an argument that's resonating with people, that if we don't clean this stuff up, not only does stuff not get built, but the money is just not going to show up, to build it?
Yeah. And if it does show up, it's going to have a much higher return expectation.
Yeah.
And therefore higher prices to the consumer. So it's not how we built our great country. It's not why we're so lucky to have such an abundant infrastructure in our country that drives such a massive economy. It's not how we got here, by pulling certificates and not giving people confidence in their ability to, if they do things right, and if they comply with the law, that they're going to be able to build things.
When do you think we left the road as a nation around all this stuff? Like if you go back to World War II, we were the guys that could build, however many bombers a day. Like we were it. And then somewhere along the way, we became the highly bureaucratic, highly unpredictable, can't build anything group. When did we, what was the big drop?
Yeah, I think it's been a frog in the boiling pot. I started building, I started with Williams as an engineer, and I remember running into some silly things every once in a while where you'd think, and here's the problem: if you were a project manager and you had somebody ask you to do something silly, you'd be like, I don't have time to fight that. Like, that's stupid, and I know it's going to show up on the next project, but I got to get this project done. So a regulator wants to be important. Everybody wants to be important in their life. And if they just give you an approval and don't require something different on their project, so I just think we've just seen this regulatory creep that's just gone on and on and on. And then when things started to get litigated, then it became a whole cottage industry to make money off of litigation and get paid. Companies get sued all the time now, and then you pay off the person that's suing you so you can move on with the project. And they know it because they know they stand in between you and a lot of value. And so that, in fact, one of the reforms that I didn't mention, because I just didn't want to get into that level of detail, but a lot of litigation reform in NEPA that's part of this bill as well, that will shut down people's ability to come up. Somebody that has nothing to do with the project, not a landowner, no harm, have the ability to come in and sue on these projects. But I think, that's been a big driver on it. There's a lot of money made because there's enough value. Once you've got once you've got one leg over the fence on these projects, you're pretty vulnerable to have to, pay up on a lawsuit because it's kind of a sunk cost analysis. And so the NEPA law today allows for litigation from anybody and everybody. And that I think has kind of, driven some of how crazy it's gotten. But I don't think there was any one, to answer your question, I don't think there was any one particular thing that happens. I mean, people always say, well, gosh, it was the Biden administration or Trump administration. The Constitution Project got shut down during Trump won, because it was Governor Cuomo that actually shut it down. So I don't think it's, any one catalyst, frankly.
Bill, any perspective you would bring to the boiling frog problem there?
Well, let me say this. He's exactly right about it being the boiling frog. It's cumulative. There's just one new regulation seems like it's appropriate, then another one. And then, of course, the way the statutes were written is that there was no standardization of how litigation could be brought or settled. And so pretty soon, as the senator said, it becomes a cottage industry. One of the key points that the senator made that I think it needs to be stressed, both from a policy perspective and a political perspective, is that to the extent that we have friction in the regulatory process, then it drives up cost for infrastructure. The cost of that is paid by the consumer. And the senator made that point. And high utility costs are aggressive. They're a tax on lower income Americans more than any other group. And so I think if we need to stress that more often, if you really want to have affordable energy for consumers, particularly low income Americans, we need to have permitting reform that brings us greater infrastructure and brings it more quickly. So I think the senator did a good job of bringing that up. One of the things I would ask the senator is, who would be against this? I mean, you did say, I think at the outset of your conversation, that the Democratic leadership has said no bills are going to pass that would benefit anybody. What consumer groups would be against this? What other groups would be against what you're trying to do here, which, sounds perfectly appropriate to do today?
Yeah, come up with anything out there today that doesn't cost taxpayer money, provides benefit for everybody, especially low income, grows our economy, allows us to be more competitive, and actually could reduce federal administration costs, not increase it. I mean, it's almost impossible to find something like that. And tomorrow I'm giving a floor speech on this. And that particular point that you just asked, Bill, like, who would be against this? Like, why would anybody oppose this other than the cottage industry of litigants? Who in the world would oppose this? Maybe our enemies might oppose this because they see it as a huge vulnerability and weakness of our democracy. But other than that, who in the world would oppose this? And so we're going to be asking that question exactly on the floor tomorrow as we're starting to put pressure on moving this bill forward.
Well, hopefully your Senate colleagues will listen closely, because you remember the anti-fracking campaign had a lot of Russian backing behind it. I'm sure that the anti-regulatory reform movement would have. I'm certain there's probably some Chinese that could be behind, some Chinese influence that could be up
for
behind
sure.
As
Why
well.
wouldn't you exploit our vulnerability there? Yeah.
And I hate to bring this up, but if you look at a FERC solution when it comes to transmission versus a solution within the boundaries of one state, of course, I've got to talk about Texas. Texas is able to plan and build and energize transmission in about half the time of a FERC jurisdiction. So I think that's an example that could be used. I hate to use the whole Texas versus Oklahoma or anybody else construct here, but I think I think those are examples to show how, if you have permitting within a state, it can move much more quickly and much more beneficial for consumers and for economic growth.
Yeah. I think the bills that are likely to come forward on transmission will likely be ones that give the state the right to do it first. But if a developer isn't able to get the rights they need across the state, that they can come appeal to the FERC. for interstate commerce and eminent domain through that. But as long as it's getting done through the states, then FERC's never involved. So I think that's what you'll see coming forward on transmission bills on this.
And one last question, I'll kick it back to Maynard and the Veriton team is, do you see anything in this bill that could help with respect to nuclear energy?
Well, I think to the degree that anything related to NEPA and NEPA reform will help the nuclear industry, particularly as it relates to the litigation standards and the no vacature on certificates, which the nuclear industry is ripe. I mean, talk about an industry that has to spend a lot of money up front and then is completely vulnerable to a lawsuit that they have to pay off just to, keep the project moving. This will curtail that and really take a lot of that. What people have to, like, if you're actually doing a project today and you don't put a budget item in there for paying off the cottage industry on a big project, you're kidding yourself. And so I think, removing that line item will be pretty important, and it also dramatically reduces delays as well. So yes, I think the nuclear industry would benefit from this.
Well, I'm excited about what you're doing, and I hope we get a lot of people behind it in the Senate.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, Alan, that was one of the things, back to the sort of a frog in a boiling water analogy. I think what's interesting to me is I think the reason that a lot of permitting, a lot of these regulations haven't occurred over the last 20 or 30 years is because guess what? Over the last 20 years, you didn't have any growth in power, right? And over the next couple of years, you're going to have 1.5%, 2%, and then sort of 27, 28, 29, 30, you're going to go up to 2.5 to 3%. So when you had no growth, you could get out there and bitch and complain and stall, no consequences whatsoever. Now, the consequence in the next 12 to 18 months is you're going to have potential brownouts. You're going to have people getting their electricity turned off when they don't want to. And so I think, your other members of the Senate should understand it. But what's interesting to me, and is a question for you, is that it seems like the scapegoat used to be the pipeline industry, the electric utilities, but the scapegoat now has become the data center companies. They're the guys who are driving up power prices. And it's interesting, it would seem like 4, 5, 6, 7 years ago, they would have been on the other side. It seems like now they're getting all the negativity is being focused on them. Are they engaged with you guys now? How are they basically, engaging with the Senate and Congress?
Yeah, they definitely are, unfortunately. And they really get this. I mean, it's not lost on them that they've become the scapegoat. And they're really starting to turn the knobs up on their government affairs efforts. But they've become so negative so fast that politicians that lean into a populist point of view are like that, regardless of the fact that if you're an American, you better hope that we win this race. But again, it's this mentality that we all fear from the outside, but I can tell you is alive and real on the inside, which is people will do whatever it takes to get them elected because they think it's so important that I'm in office that I should, do whatever's popular in the short term, condemning our country in the long term. And, that's unfortunate, and it's a very broad statement. I agree. But that really is part of the problem is the data centers have gone from being the darlings to the Trump crony crowd that Democrats are not going to support. And yes, first it was the reason your power bill is high is because of climate change and it's gotten hotter and therefore your bill's gone up. That was the first one. Second one was, it went up because Trump ended subsidies for wind and solar production, and that's killed new investment, and that's why your bill is higher all of a sudden. And now that's the data centers. It's never going to be, because we wouldn't let a pipeline get built across our state.
And what we found, and what one of our friends talks a lot about is the costs that are borne by the consumer is not basically the transmission and generation, is the last mile. And that's the stuff that, people, at the state level just throw in there, just, environmental costs, whatever the cost may be. And so there's not a lot of truth there. But the sad thing is that we're going to be bumping up against capacity quickly here. And you never want to have legislation being driven because it has to be driven because you're in an emergency situation.
Yeah.
And I worry that the senators and congressmen don't realize how close we are to an emergency situation here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we saw it here 3 weeks ago. PJM was shedding loads, on an emergency basis up here in this market. And, prices went from $90 to $1,569, in a matter of 20 hours. So, we've seen those instances where that is starting to come up. And as I tell people, like, don't think that's an anomaly. That's just the beginning. Like, this is going to get a lot worse. All you have to do is fly into the PJM area and see the enormous amount of data centers being built here. And where people think it's going to get better if there's not transmission lines being built at the same time, is kind of beyond me how people think that actually works. But it is become to your point, and it really worries me, even in the state of Oklahoma, which, I consider to be a very business-friendly environment. Even in the state of Oklahoma, people are fighting data centers from getting built. They're fighting an aluminum smelter from coming in. And unfortunately, we have gubernatorial candidates that, because it's popular, not because they think it's the right thing, they're coming out against them, just to get the favorable vote. So really disappointing to see that, particularly in a state like Oklahoma. But yeah, it's the data center negativity is a very real thing, and it really concerns me. But it's a bright light example of people putting their own, personal popularity in front of what they know is best for a country long term. I refuse to believe they're that ignorant.
There's populism versus good policy making, and unfortunately, the populism seems to win more often than it should.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you, the data centers are a 50-state issue, and the Chinese have to be loving this.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. You wonder, to your point earlier, Bill, you wonder where that, where all this opposition just magically appeared from, because it's ad valorem, it's property tax in people's school districts. There's a lot of huge positives that come out of that. So anyway, that's a really concerning issue. But I do think that, the hyperscalers are really pouring the effort and energy in to learning how to go into the communities first and actually be invited into the area. And I think that will work out well for them. So I'm thrilled to see them getting so active in that space.
I agree.
Alan, anything you would add from how and I remember this, Bill, from your career when you were up in DC, you kind of got to learn the art of all this, and then you also have to learn the mechanics of all this. And so you're working, I assume, how does energy dominance, DOE, Department of Interior, the White House, how do those constituents fit in as you try to get something over the goal line here?
Yeah, well, they are absolutely critical. And one of the things I didn't mention was that one of the main oppositions from the Dems that are trying to be constructive is a lot of the wind power projects that have been held up by the Department of War over radar sensitivities on having to reform radar against drone swarms. And so there's a lot of effort going on that front, but it is both a piece of leverage, and it's also a poison pill to getting anything done right now. And so that's a really important part of getting this done, is working with the administration to be fair to the renewables industry. And my point of view on the topic is, hey, as long as there's not subsidies involved, like, bring it. Why would we not take on we need all the power we can get. So as long as it's not being subsidized, let's encourage it rather than try to stand in the way of it. But that's going to be a little bit of a shift in the White House that's going to be needed to get this across the line.
And historically, labor unions have been a source of, I think, support for these types of things. Is that something you can comment on?
Oh yeah, no, they very much are a big part of supporting. They were in support for our bill when we rolled it out, and they've been, pretty vocal. We need all sources of energy right now. I know people are kind of exhausted on permitting reform because it's kind of been a topic for so long with so little progress. But we really need industry right now and the labor unions to really be pounding the table, particularly on the Democrats, that we need to get something done short order.
So for people watching, which our community is energy, power, technology, business, what's a way to be useful here? You can call your representative and I know those types of things, but how do we help you get this done?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think, one is to the degree relationships with, Secretary Wright, Secretary Burgum, and, they know this issue really, really well. They're, on top of it. But I think making sure they know that they have the industry's strong support in allowing wind and renewable projects to go forward as well, because that issue is on the bubble a little bit, and the more confidence they have that the broad energy industry is supportive of that, as long as there's not subsidies involved, I think is actually helpful to getting a bill done. And then secondly, I think pushing on all the Democrats, and particularly the moderate Dems, on how important it is that we get this done and get it done now. Because I think if the House flips, if you look at who would be leading the key committees in the House on getting permitting reform done, that is not a pretty picture. And if we can't get it done now, I'm not sure when that window of opportunity is going to be. So I think making sure that really talking to the moderate Dems out there about the importance of really pushing for getting this done now is important as well.
So just legislatively, if this happens, when do you think this happens, or what would you tell us about the timing here?
Well,
how's your calendar look between now and that?
Yeah, it's very busy. And every day something new comes up, some new wrench is thrown in, seems like every day. But so I think it's very hard to predict. But Leader Thune has come out and, said that he would hope we would be addressing bipartisan issues, any particularly named permitting reform is one of the top issues in September. So that's a very short work period, but I'm certainly hopeful that we're going to get something done on that. Shelley Moore Capito leads EPW. Mike Lee leads the E&R committee. Those two committees are key. Whether something comes out of those committees or not is questionable. We want to make sure we've got a bill there ready to go that is completely buttoned down, has been scrubbed every way, been scrubbed by industry. We don't want to get surprised by somebody that's against it at the last minute. So we've been really working hard to make sure that bill is really a clean and detailed document that that's not going to surprise somebody. And so if the committees don't come up with something that is very similar to it, we're hoping that this is ready to adopt very quickly through committee. So that's our goal right now.
I'm curious, Senator, because a lot of times I notice in these discussions, once you start talking about energy and infrastructure and national security and economics and growth and development, it's just as frequently the case we're talking with a Republican. But there are obviously lots of Democrats who feel similarly and support those things and want the world to want us to do better there. Are there some Democrats you might point us to that have been particularly helpful here that, maybe we could reach out to them? And I'm just thinking, how we can embrace the bipartisan spirit of all this.
No, I appreciate that question. I would say John Hickenlooper, Colorado, obviously, really understands the energy issue, and he's critical. Brian Schatz, I think, is a critical leader within the Dems that's, smart about this. Senator Kim, Senator Slotkin from Michigan has been, pretty pragmatic on these issues. Padilla actually, I think, knows that transmission needs to get done. Martin Heinrich from New Mexico has been, really engaged in this. Peter Welch actually showed up for our rollout of the bill and spoke as strongly as anybody about the importance of getting this done. So the good news is his wife is actually a utility commissioner in New England. And so she, this is not lost on her how important this is to get this done. So, anyway, we continue to work that circle pretty hard, but it's expanding. I'll tell you that. So, Tim Kaine, even though he's been really interested in getting this done as well. So,
well, we really appreciate all this work you're doing. Just diving into Mike said the frog is getting boiled. You dove into the water with the frog. So bless you. As you think about this, you're going to serve through January, right, of 27. I know this is real important to your time in the Senate, but any last comment on this new career choice you've made, and what's a big takeaway?
Well, I'm honored to get the chance to do it. I think it's, a great opportunity for me to try to give back to the country, and I feel really good about getting the opportunity to do it. I don't think I'd be the right man to do this for the long term, but I'm glad that I've got the opportunity to contribute here in the short term.
Do you get a lot of?
I want to add on to that, Senator. So you've gone through the energy transition from being an energy CEO to being an energy state senator. What is the biggest positive surprise you've experienced, and the biggest negative experience that you've had since you've made this transition?
I think the positive side is just all the incredible talent that's here, within the Capitol, that's really dedicated to trying to make our country better. And so that's really impressive to me. There's a lot of, really talented, smart people, young and old here, that very much focus on trying to make the country better. And that's really been encouraging to me. And, but it also says, hey, I'm a leader. I better be the guy that can help show that talent how to get something done. So it kind of, puts responsibility on me when, you have this much talent that's so capable. In terms of negative, I would just say it's definitely been this concept of the party being more important than our country. And that just, it always really pains me when I see what's best for our country be way down the list of considerations when people are calculating what they're going to do. And so that's disappointing, but I'll caveat that to say that is definitely not everybody. And unfortunately, there's a bit of a culture, I would say, in that regard, but it is definitely not everybody. There's some people that act very courageously around here for the benefit of the country. So I'm thrilled to see that. Well,
thanks so much for your time. Thanks so much for everything you're doing, and call on us as we can be helpful. This is really important.
Very good. All right, guys. Thank you all very much. Enjoyed the visit today.
Thank you, Alan.
Good luck. Get it passed.
Thank you.